They said my great-grandfather's bridge was an eyesore and had it bulldozed at 6 a.m. while I was at his funeral. By the time I got back from burying the man who built it with his own hands, 50 years of family memories were floating in pieces down Clearwater Lake, and the smell of diesel exhaust was still hanging in the morning mist like a funeral shroud. Picture this. You're standing in a cemetery, dirt still fresh under your fingernails from throwing that last handful of earth, when your phone buzzes with a video from your neighbor. The sound hits you first, chainsaws screaming through century-old oak like they're cutting through your heart. Then the visual, that hand-hewn timber bridge, every plank carved by Ezra Thorne in 1952, collapsing into the water in slow motion. The bridge where I learned to fish with worms that squirm between my 8-year-old fingers, where my father proposed to my mother on a moonlit night in 1978, where 3 generations of Thorns had crossed to reach our little slice of paradise on a 12-acre island that was about to become our prison. Now we're stranded, no legal access except by boat, while the Lakeside Estates HOA's shiny new luxury resort sits pretty on the opposite shore. Their president, Cordelia Brightwater, probably sipping her morning champagne from a crystal flute, thinking she's just eliminated the last obstacle to her perfect lakeside empire. But here's what this wannabe dictator with her pressed khakis and laminated rulebooks didn't know. That bridge wasn't just sentimental. It was the legal key to water rights worth millions, and when I discovered what they'd built their $4 million 0-cents resort on, well, let's just say some foundations are more fragile than others. What would you do if someone destroyed your family's legacy while you were burying the man who built it? Drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. I bet your HOA has some stories that'll make your blood boil too. Because this isn't just about revenge. This is about what happens when regular people finally fight back against petty tyrants who think rules are for everyone else. My name is Jasper Thorne, and I'm what you might call a dying breed, a third-generation boat mechanic who still builds fishing boats by hand. At 45, I've got motor oil permanently stained under my fingernails and calluses that tell the story of every piece of wood I've ever shaped. Great-grandfather Ezra wasn't just a craftsman, he was a visionary. Back in 1952, when he bought that 12-acre island for $800, 0 cents and a handshake, Clearwater Lake was just a sleepy fishing spot. Ezra built everything himself, the cabin, the workshop, and that bridge. Every timber hand-selected, every joint carved with tools that are still hanging in my workshop today. The smell of cedar shavings and varnish had become my cologne, the sound of hand planes on wood better than any music. Our weekend cabin sat on the island like a postcard from a simpler time, surrounded by workshop buildings, where I'd perfected 20 years of boat building. And then she arrived. Cordelia Brightwater moved here 3 years ago with lawyer money and courtroom attitude. Picture this, a woman who iron presses her khakis every morning, drives a spotless white BMW SUV with a Rules Matter vanity plate, and never walks anywhere without a leather portfolio full of violation notices, perfectly manicured nails that had never touched dirt, speaking in legal jargon even when ordering coffee. From day one, Cordelia made it clear she was here to upgrade our neighborhood. What used to be a community of fishing families suddenly became a battleground of property values and aesthetic standards. She'd cruise the lake in her pristine pontoon boat, taking photos of anything that didn't meet her vision of lakeside perfection. The bridge became her obsession. She called it an unauthorized structure, an environmental hazard, despite being legally grandfathered in before any zoning laws existed. She'd stand on the resort's deck with binoculars, documenting every family member who crossed, plotting like a general planning an invasion. The funeral ambush was perfectly calculated. Ezra died Tuesday night, peacefully at 96. The funeral was Thursday afternoon. Half the county came to pay respects to a man who'd built boats for 3 generations of fishermen. By Thursday evening, I was emotionally and physically drained. The demolition happened Friday at dawn. The crew arrived like an invasion force. 3 trucks, a bulldozer, chainsaws screaming through century-old oak. They had a 48-hour emergency notice, citing immediate safety concerns, filed while we were grieving, designed to prevent any legal challenge. I'll never forget that sound, not just the chainsaws, but the crack of century-old timber snapping like gunshots, the smell of diesel exhaust mixing with morning lake mist, muddy tire tracks crisscrossing the sacred ground where my great-grandfather's ashes were scattered just 2 days before. By the time I got the neighbor's call and raced back, it was over. 50 years of family history was floating in pieces down Clearwater Lake, and Cordelia was standing on the resort's deck with a satisfied smile, watching the cleanup crew haul away the debris. The immediate impact was devastating. Grandmother Dolores, 89 and sharp as ever, couldn't visit Ezra's gravesite anymore, too frail to travel by boat. My workshop started suffering water damage without bridge access for deliveries. Property values plummeted when buyers realized they'd need a boat to reach their own home. But the worst part was the isolation. For the first time in 70 years, the Thorne family was cut off from the community we'd helped build. We were prisoners on our own island, watching strangers enjoy the lake our great-grandfather had loved. That's when I started noticing the surveyors, strange men with official-looking equipment, measuring water depths near where our bridge used to stand. They'd arrive in unmarked boats, take readings, and disappear. When I asked Cordelia about it during her courtesy notification visit, she just smiled and mentioned development opportunities and highest and best use. The pieces were starting to fit together, but I didn't see the full picture yet. All I knew was that destroying our bridge was just the beginning of something much bigger and much more sinister. The legal harassment started exactly 1 week after the bridge demolition. Cordelia wasn't content with just cutting off our access. She wanted to make sure we knew who was in charge. First came the nuisance complaints. According to her freshly printed violation notices, my boat storage was now unsightly and detrimental to property values. Never mind that I'd been storing boats in the same spot for 20 years, or that they were visible from exactly one angle, the resort's premium deck where guests paid $300.00 a night for lakefront views. Then the cease and desist letters arrived. Apparently our family had been trespassing every time we used the fishing spots where Ezra had taught me to cast a line. Cordelia claimed the HOA now held exclusive water rights to the entire lake based on something called continuous usage doctrine. The kicker? She threatened fines of $500.00 per day for any unauthorized watercraft operation. That included my grandmother's pontoon boat, the rowboat I'd built with my own hands, and even the kayak my teenage nephew used for fishing. I could taste the anger rising in my throat like bile. This woman was trying to turn our family lake into her private swimming pool. But here's the thing about growing up in a family of builders. You learn that every problem has a solution, and sometimes the best tools are the ones nobody thinks to use. While Cordelia was busy printing violation notices, I was busy digging through dusty boxes in my grandmother's attic. What I found changed everything. Tucked between my great-grandfather's war medals and my grandmother's wedding dress was a manila envelope marked Lake Property Important. Inside were Ezra's original handwritten survey notes, complete with hand-drawn maps and measurements that would make a modern surveyor weep with envy. The trip to the county courthouse was like striking gold. The clerk, a woman named Betty who remembered my great-grandfather, helped me pull the original 1952 land patents. What we discovered made my heart race faster than a two-stroke engine at full throttle. Ezra hadn't just bought an island. He'd bought the mineral and water rights to the entire lake bed. Rights that were never transferred, never sold, just forgotten as the years passed and the family focused on boat building instead of real estate law. But here's the beautiful part. Those rights were still legally mine. Every boat that touched the water, every swimmer who took a dip, every fancy yacht that anchored near the resort, they were all using my family's property without permission. The next discovery was even better. The original property deed included something called a perpetual easement for bridge access. In plain English, that meant the right to build and maintain a bridge was legally attached to our property forever. It couldn't be revoked by an HOA, couldn't be voted away by a neighborhood committee, and couldn't be eliminated by a woman with a laminated rule book. Here's your legal nugget. Always check original property deeds, not just current HOA rules. Older rights often trump new regulations. I decided to test my theory. Using Ezra's original 1952 blueprints, I started rebuilding the bridge exactly as it had been. The sound of my hammer echoing across the lake felt like a battle cry, each nail driven with the fury of 3 generations of thorns. That's when Cordelia made her next move. She came clicking across the dock in her boat shoes, sheriff's deputy in tow, claiming I was committing environmental destruction. The deputy, a young guy named Martinez who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, couldn't determine the legality on the spot. He ordered me to stop work, pending investigation, which was exactly what Cordelia wanted. But she wasn't satisfied with just stopping me. She pulled out her phone and started filming, narrating like she was documenting a crime scene. "This is what environmental terrorism looks like," she announced to her camera, the smell of fresh pine lumber mixing with her expensive perfume, as she got close enough to make sure I was in frame. The taste of sawdust was still in my mouth when I watched her next door post go live that evening. She'd painted me as some kind of eco-villain, complete with dramatic photos and warnings about dangerous precedents. What she didn't know was that I'd been filming too. Every violation notice, every threatening letter, every interaction with law enforcement. And unlike her social media theatrics, my documentation was about to become evidence in a much bigger case. The mini twist that changed everything? While she was busy playing victim online, I was quietly filing paperwork with the county to officially record my water rights and easement claims. But the real shocker came when I discovered the filing fees. Apparently, asserting water rights also meant I could charge rent for their use. Every boat in that resort marina using my lake bed, every swimmer in their designated beach area trespassing on my property, every drop of water their fancy fountain pumped, flowing over land I legally owned. Cordelia wanted to play property rights games? Game on. But she just brought a laminated rulebook to a legal gunfight. Cordelia's social media campaign was just the warm-up act. Within 48 hours, she'd escalated to full-scale social warfare that would make a Pentagon strategist proud. The Save Our Lake petition appeared everywhere, complete with professional graphics painting my family as environmental terrorists. But Cordelia wasn't satisfied with online drama. She started spreading rumors that cut deeper. Suddenly, I was allegedly running illegal business operations and evading taxes. 20 years of honest reputation shredded by whispers and innuendo. The local newspaper ran a front-page hit piece titled, "Environmental Concerns Raised Over Lake Development." The reporter, clearly fed information by Cordelia, focused on potential ecological damage, without mentioning my legal easement or 70 years of family history. Then came the pressure on the town council to fast-track new zoning restrictions. If Cordelia couldn't stop me from rebuilding what was already there, she'd make sure it could never be replaced again. The smell of diesel fuel and fresh lumber still lingered around my workshop, but now it was mixed with the bitter taste of fighting for something that should have been unquestionable: my family's right to exist in the place we'd called home for generations. But two can play the community organizing game. While Cordelia was busy with her petition drive, I was quietly building something more powerful: actual relationships with actual neighbors. I started hosting free boat repair workshops every Saturday morning. Nothing fancy, just neighbors bringing their outboards, sharing coffee and stories while I taught basic maintenance. The sound of wrenches on engines and the smell of motor oil became a weekly ritual that brought people together in ways that laminated rule books never could. The breakthrough came when I shared our family story at the Historical Society meeting. I brought photo albums dating back to the 1950s, showing how the lake had evolved from a working fishing community to whatever Cordelia was trying to turn it into. That's when I met Marcus Rivera, a retired environmental scientist who'd been quietly documenting changes to the lake ecosystem. Marcus had data that would make any environmental lawyer salivate, and it completely demolished Cordelia's narrative. "Want to see something that'll blow your mind?" Marcus asked, pulling out a folder thick with charts and water quality reports. "I've been taking measurements for 3 years, right since that resort started construction." The numbers told a story Cordelia definitely didn't want publicized. Dissolved oxygen levels near the resort had dropped 30%. Water clarity had decreased significantly. Fish population had declined 40% since the resort's grand opening. But here's the kicker. Marcus had historical photos proving the lake was actually cleaner and healthier when my family bridge was intact. Our small-scale access had less environmental impact than the resort's massive development and constant boat traffic. Here's your environmental nugget. Environmental impact studies are public record. Always check if developments actually followed their own promises. I started building an alliance with environmental groups by proposing native fish habitat restoration around our bridge area. Suddenly, my environmental terrorism became a community-supported conservation effort. The town council hearing was packed tighter than a tackle box. Cordelia had organized her supporters, mostly resort investors who'd bought into her vision of lakeside perfection. She presented a professional slideshow with architectural renderings and property value projections. But I had something better: 3 generations of local history and hard environmental data. When I stood up to speak, the room got quiet in a way that made the hair on my arms stand up. Mrs. Brightwater talks about protecting our lake, I said, looking directly at the council members. But my family has been protecting this lake since before she knew it existed, and we've got the water quality data to prove it. Marcus presented his findings. Local fishing guides testified about declining fish populations. The Historical Society president read testimonials from families quietly pressured to sell to resort developers. That's when the evening took an unexpected turn. Cordelia stood up, her face red with anger, and made a fatal mistake. "These people are trying to destroy everything we've built here," she shouted. "Some of us actually care about property values and progress, not living in the past like hillbillies." The room went dead silent. She'd just insulted half the families in the county, the same families whose votes the council members needed to keep their jobs. The council couldn't ignore the evidence, but they also couldn't ignore Cordelia's political pressure. Their compromise was predictably bureaucratic: table the decision pending a comprehensive environmental review, and grant a temporary restraining order preventing further bridge construction. Walking out of that meeting, I felt the crunch of gravel under my boots and realized something important. Cordelia's public meltdown had just shown everyone her true colors. This wasn't about environmental protection. It was about a woman who saw local families as obstacles to her vision of lakeside perfection. The real fight wasn't about bridges or property rights. It was about who got to decide what our community would become. And Cordelia had just made it clear that people like my family weren't part of her plan. Cordelia's public meltdown at the town council meeting should have been a warning, but apparently humiliation only made her more dangerous. Within a week of calling half the county hillbillies, she'd shifted from social pressure to financial warfare, the kind that can destroy families who don't have lawyer money to fight back. The liens came first. Thick legal documents claiming our family owed $12,000, 0 cents, in unpaid fines for violations dating back months. Apparently, every day our boats had been illegally stored, every time we'd used unauthorized water access, every moment our workshop had been non-compliant, it all added up to a debt that could force us into bankruptcy. The paperwork was impressive: professional letterhead, legal jargon, official-looking stamps, but it was also complete fiction. The fines were for violations of HOA rules that didn't legally apply to our property, enforced by an authority that didn't exist, for activities that had been grandfathered in before Cordelia was even born. But here's the thing about legal harassment: it doesn't have to be legitimate to be effective. The threat of foreclosure proceedings felt real when you're holding the papers in your hands, the expensive legal paper rough against your fingertips. The 30-day deadline felt real when you're calculating whether you can afford to fight it. Then came the generous offer. Cordelia's lawyer called personally to let me know she was willing to graciously purchase our property for $50,000, 0 cents, about a quarter of its actual market value. A fair price, considering the legal complications, he said, like he was doing us a favor. The smell of fear was sharper than any workshop chemical. I could taste it in my mouth when I looked at my 89-year-old grandmother, wondering if I was about to lose the only home she'd ever known because some lawyer from the city decided our family didn't belong here anymore. That's when I realized I was done playing defense. Time to find out exactly what kind of legal ground Cordelia was standing on. I hired Winston Clearwater, and yes, the irony of that name wasn't lost on anyone. Winston was a retired environmental lawyer who'd moved to the lake for the fishing, but couldn't resist the chance to practice a little law on the side. He had the kind of sharp eyes that come from 40 years of reading contracts, and the dry humor that comes from watching people try to get away with things they shouldn't. "Let me get this straight," Winston said, spreading Cordelia's legal threats across his desk like he was examining evidence of a crime. "She's claiming you owe HOA fees for property that predates the HOA, violation fines for activities that were legal before the HOA existed, and environmental penalties for a bridge that was grandfathered in before environmental regulations were written That's about the size of it, I said. Winston leaned back in his chair and smiled. Well, this should be fun. The first discovery was beautiful in its simplicity. Our family had never actually joined the HOA. Membership wasn't automatic. It required signing documents and paying dues. The HOA had simply assumed our property was included because it was in their service area. But assumption isn't the same as legal authority. The second discovery was even better. The original covenants that created the HOA specifically excluded pre-existing structures and uses. My great-grandfather's bridge, my workshop, our boat storage, all of it was explicitly protected from HOA interference. But the third discovery was the nuclear option. Winston's research into the bridge demolition revealed that Cordelia's emergency order was based on a safety inspection that never actually happened. The structural engineer who signed off on the demolition had never set foot on our property. The entire legal justification was built on fraudulent documentation. You know what this means? Winston asked, his eyes lighting up with the kind of joy that comes from catching someone in a lie. It means she destroyed our bridge based on fake paperwork, I said. It means she's guilty of criminal destruction of property, fraud, and about 6 other felonies I can think of off the top of my head. Here's your legal nugget. You can't be forced to join an HOA if your property predates their formation. Check your deed's recording date against the HOA's incorporation papers. We filed a countersuit that was a thing of beauty. $500,000, 0 cents in damages for illegal demolition, harassment, and interference with property rights, punitive damages for fraud and criminal destruction of property, and an injunction to prevent any further harassment while the case proceeded. The town council meeting where I announced our legal action was standing room only. Word had spread that the Thorne family was finally fighting back, and half the county showed up to see what would happen. I stood up with Winston's legal brief in my hands and a smile on my face. I'd like to thank Mrs. Brightwater for her educational campaign about property rights, I said. It inspired me to do some research of my own. I produced the original deed showing our water rights, the HOA covenants that explicitly protected our property, the fraudulent safety inspection that justified our bridge demolition. Each document hit like a hammer blow, and I could see Cordelia's face getting redder with every revelation. It turns out, I continued, that the HOA has no legal authority over property that predates their formation. The liens they've filed are fraudulent, the fines they've assessed are illegal, and the bridge they demolished was destroyed based on fake paperwork. The room erupted. Other families began standing up, sharing their own stories of HOA harassment, properties sold under pressure, families forced out by fraudulent fees, a pattern of abuse that had been hidden because nobody thought they could fight back. Cordelia stood up, her voice shaking with rage. This is ridiculous. You can't just ignore community standards because your property is old. You're absolutely right, I said. But you can ignore fake legal documents, created by people who think rules don't apply to them. That's when Winston stood up and delivered the line that made the whole room gasp. Mrs. Brightwater, you should also know that filing fraudulent liens is a federal crime. My client will be filing a criminal complaint with the FBI tomorrow morning. The look on Cordelia's face was worth every sleepless night, every worried conversation with my grandmother, every moment of fear that we might lose our home. She'd tried to use the law as a weapon against families who couldn't fight back. Now she was about to learn what happens when the law fights back. And based on the murmurs I was hearing from other families in the room, she was about to face a lot more than just one criminal complaint. The breakthrough came at 2 a.m. on a Tuesday, 3 weeks after our legal counterattack. I was in my workshop, unable to sleep, sanding down a piece of cedar by lamplight when my phone buzzed with an email from Winston. The subject line made my heart race. You need to see this now. What I discovered in that email would change everything, not just for my family, but for every person who'd ever been intimidated by Cordelia Brightwater's version of progress. Winston had been digging deeper into the resort's construction permits, following a paper trail that led through state environmental agencies, federal wetland protections, and county zoning boards. What he found was a house of cards built on lies, bribes, and the kind of bureaucratic corruption that makes honest people lose faith in the system. The Lakeside Estates Resort wasn't just built on my family's water rights, it was built on federally protected wetlands. The original environmental permits, filed in 2018, were for seasonal cabins with minimal environmental impact. 12 small structures, septic systems designed for weekend use, and boat docks limited to personal watercraft. The kind of development that might actually coexist with the lake's ecosystem. But that's not what got built. Instead, Cordelia had constructed a year-round luxury resort with 40 guest suites, a commercial kitchen, a conference center, and boat docks that could handle yachts up to 60 feet long. The septic system was handling 5 times its permitted capacity. The seasonal designation meant they were supposed to be closed from November through March, but they'd been operating year-round since day one. Every single day of operation was a federal crime. The water quality data that Marcus had been collecting suddenly made perfect sense. The dissolved oxygen levels, the declining fish populations, the algae blooms that had started appearing every summer. It wasn't natural lake aging. It was the result of a massive, illegal development dumping untreated waste into a protected ecosystem. But here's the part that made my hands shake as I read Winston's email. The resort's boat docks, swimming areas, and septic discharge points were all located on the lake bottom that my great-grandfather's deed had given our family ownership of. For 3 years, Cordelia had been running an illegal resort on my property, violating federal environmental laws and generating $4 million, 0 cents in annual revenue while doing it. I had to read that sentence 3 times before it sank in. The woman who'd destroyed my family's bridge, called us hillbillies, and tried to steal our home, had been operating a criminal enterprise on our land the entire time. The power dynamic hadn't just shifted, it had completely reversed. I wasn't just the victim of HOA harassment anymore. I was the legal owner of the land that a multi-million-dollar criminal enterprise was operating on. I had the standing to shut down the entire operation with a single phone call to the EPA. But Winston's research revealed something even more damning. Internal emails between Cordelia and her contractors, obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request, showed that she'd known about the violations from the beginning. Her own environmental consultants had warned against the current development. The construction crew had raised concerns about building in protected wetlands. Even the county inspector had questioned the scale of the project. Cordelia had ignored them all, betting that nobody would have the knowledge or resources to challenge her. She'd systematically silenced opposition by buying out families, intimidating locals, and using fraudulent legal threats to prevent anyone from getting close enough to discover the truth. The bridge demolition wasn't just petty revenge. It was a strategic move to keep my family away from the shoreline areas where the worst violations were happening. She'd destroyed our bridge to prevent us from documenting the evidence that could bring down her entire operation. The scope of her deception was breathtaking. Fake environmental reports, bribed inspectors, forged safety certifications, a web of corruption that stretched from the county courthouse to the state environmental agency, all designed to protect a development that should never have been built. I sat in my workshop, surrounded by the smell of cedar shavings and the sound of water lapping against the shore, holding evidence that could destroy Cordelia's empire and restore our lake to what it was meant to be. But I also realized something that made my chest tight with emotion. My great-grandfather hadn't just left us a bridge and a cabin. He'd left us the legal tools to protect the lake he'd loved for 70 years. This wasn't just about justice for my family anymore. This was about every family that had been driven away by fraudulent HOA harassment, every lake that had been damaged by illegal development, every community that had been told to shut up and accept progress, even when that progress was built on lies. Cordelia had made one fatal mistake. She'd assumed that people like my family would never fight back, never dig deeper, never discover the truth. She'd bet everything on the idea that regular folks would be too intimidated by legal threats and too poor to hire lawyers. But she'd forgotten something important about people who build things with their hands. We know how to take things apart, too. And when you really understand how something is built, you can see exactly where the weak points are. The nuclear option wasn't just available now, it was inevitable. The only question was whether to use it quietly, through proper legal channels, or to expose everything publicly and let the community see what their progress had really cost them. As I sat there in the pre-dawn darkness, listening to the lake that had been my family's home for 70 years, I realized that Cordelia Brightwater was about to learn a lesson that every good craftsman knows. If you build something on a rotten foundation, Eventually, the whole thing comes crashing down. The next morning, I called a war council. Not the kind with generals and battle plans, but the kind that happens around kitchen tables when regular people decide they've had enough of being pushed around. Winston arrived first, carrying a briefcase that looked like it had survived 3 decades of environmental lawsuits. Marcus came next, his arms full of water testing equipment and a laptop containing 3 years of data that would make any EPA agent's eyes light up. My grandmother Dolores shuffled in from the main cabin, sharp as ever at 89, carrying a shoebox full of photographs and documents that told the story of our lake before Cordelia arrived. The final member of our unlikely alliance was Sage Moonbeam. Yes, that's her real name, the editor of the Clearwater Gazette. Sage had grown up here, watched her own family's fishing business get squeezed out by development, and she'd been waiting years for a story that could expose what was really happening to our community. "You know," Winston said, looking around the table, "in 40 years of practice, I've never had a client who owned the crime scene. This should be interesting." The smell of my grandmother's coffee mixed with the scent of old paper and legal documents as we planned our attack. This wasn't just about revenge anymore, it was about surgical precision. Marcus had already been collecting water quality data, but now we needed to be systematic. We set up 24/7 monitoring stations at strategic points around the lake, documenting every violation in real time. The data would be time-stamped, GPS located, and uploaded to cloud storage where it couldn't be tampered with or destroyed. Every septic overflow, every illegal discharge, every time they exceed their permitted capacity, Marcus explained, his scientific precision making each violation sound like a nail in Cordelia's coffin. We're going to document it all. While Marcus documented the environmental crimes, I started exercising my water rights in ways that would make Cordelia's operation impossible to ignore. The beauty of owning the lake bottom was that I could legally charge rent for its use, and I could set that rent at whatever rate I wanted. Winston helped me draft official notices to the resort. $2,000, 0 cents per month for dock usage, backdated to when construction began. That alone would cost them $72,000, 0 cents in unpaid rent. But the real hammer was the liability clause. As the property owner, I could be held responsible for any environmental damage caused by their illegal operations. Here's your property rights nugget. Water rights are often separate from land ownership. Check your deed for mineral and water clauses. They might be worth more than you think. My grandmother opened her shoebox and started pulling out photographs that told the story of our lake before Cordelia's improvements. Pictures of crystal clear water, children swimming safely, families of fish that used to thrive in healthy ecosystem. The visual evidence was devastating, and it was going to be even more powerful when paired with Marcus's scientific data. "We need to show people what they've lost," Dolores said, her weathered hands sorting through decades of memories, "and what they could get back if we stop this madness." Sage was already planning the media strategy. "This isn't just a local story," she said, her laptop open to environmental journalism websites. "Illegal resort built on protected wetlands, systematic corruption, families driven out by fraud. This is the kind of story that goes national." Winston was building a case that would make federal prosecutors salivate. Environmental crimes, mail fraud, conspiracy, violation of the Clean Water Act. The charges were piling up like cordwood. But the beautiful part was that we didn't need a criminal conviction to shut down the resort. "The EPA can shut them down tomorrow if they want to," Winston explained, "but they need a complaint from someone with legal standing. That's you, Jasper. You're not just a concerned citizen, you're the property owner being harmed by their illegal activities." Here's where it gets interesting. Cordelia had announced that the resort's annual shareholders meeting would be held over Labor Day weekend, just 8 weeks away. She was planning to announce a $10 million 0 cents expansion that would double the resort's capacity, complete with a grand opening of new eco-friendly amenities. Perfect timing for a surprise party. We decided to let her have her moment. Let her stand in front of 200 investors, local officials, and media representatives, bragging about her environmental stewardship and community development. Let her announce expansion plans that would require permits she'd never get. Then we'd drop the hammer. The beauty of having 8 weeks to prepare was that we could coordinate with multiple agencies simultaneously: EPA environmental violations, State Wetland Protection Agency, County Zoning Enforcement, FBI fraud investigation charges for unreported income, from illegal operations. By the time we were done, Cordelia would be facing federal, state, and local charges from 6 different agencies. But the real poetry was in the timing. Everything would hit at once, during her big celebration, in front of everyone who mattered. Here's your environmental enforcement nugget. EPA violations can be reported anonymously by anyone, but reports from property owners get priority treatment and faster response times. As we planned through the afternoon, I started building the physical evidence we'd need. A floating platform anchored over my lake bottom property, establishing continuous presence and documenting every violation. Time-lapse photography setups that would capture illegal dumping, septic overflows, and unauthorized construction. The sound of hammers and power tools filled the air as I constructed what would become our evidence-gathering operation. Every piece of equipment was positioned to document specific violations, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence that would hold up in any court. But the most satisfying part was rebuilding the bridge. Using Ezra's original 1952 plans, I started construction again, this time with proper legal documentation, environmental permits, and a team of witnesses recording every step. The bridge would be rebuilt exactly as it was, but now it represented something bigger. Proof that our family's rights couldn't be bulldozed by people who thought money could buy the right to destroy other people's homes. The smell of fresh pine lumber mixing with lake water and the sound of hammers echoing across the water felt like a promise being kept, not just to my great-grandfather, but to every family that had been driven away by people who confused wealth with wisdom. You know what the best part is? I said to Winston as we watched the sun set over the lake. She's going to destroy herself. All we have to do is document it. By sunset, we had our plan. 8 weeks of careful preparation leading up to one devastating moment when Cordelia Brightwater would discover that her empire was built on sand. She'd spent 3 years systematically destroying our community. Now it was time to return the favor, with interest. Cordelia must have sensed something was wrong. Maybe it was the way conversation stopped when she walked into the county courthouse, or how the postmaster suddenly became very interested in his paperwork whenever she came to collect her mail. Small towns have their own intelligence networks, and word was spreading that the Thorne family was fighting back. Her response was swift and vicious. The private investigator showed up first, a sleazy-looking guy in a cheap suit who spent 3 days taking photos of my workshop, following my truck to the hardware store, and asking neighbors questions about my business activities. He was about as subtle as a diesel engine with a busted muffler, but the message was clear. Cordelia was looking for dirt. When the PI came up empty, she shifted to direct sabotage. The safety inspection happened on a Tuesday morning while I was in town filing permits for my bridge reconstruction. I came home to find my workshop door kicked in, tools scattered across the floor, and half-finished boat projects mysteriously damaged. My grandfather's hand planes, tools that had been in our family for 3 generations, were broken beyond repair. The county inspector who'd supposedly conducted the inspection claimed he'd found numerous safety violations that required immediate remediation. The violations were creative, I'll give her that. Apparently my hand tools were improperly stored, and my wood shavings were a fire hazard. The inspector, a nervous little man named Kowalski who couldn't look me in the eye, handed me a violation notice that would shut down my workshop until I paid $3,000, 0 cents, in remediation fees. The smell of diesel fuel and fear hung in the air as I surveyed the damage. This wasn't just harassment anymore. This was war. And for the first time since this whole thing started, I felt something I hadn't expected. Doubt. What if we were in over our heads? What if Cordelia's money and connections were more powerful than our evidence and legal rights? But while Cordelia was busy playing dirty tricks, I was busy playing chess. Every violation notice, every inspection, every threatening phone call was being recorded and documented. I had cameras hidden throughout my property now, and every illegal entry was captured in high definition. The rumor campaign was her next move. Suddenly, I was supposedly dealing drugs out of my workshop, evading taxes on my boat sales, and operating an illegal salvage business. The rumors spread through the community like wildfire, designed to isolate me and turn neighbors against my family. I could see the doubt in some people's eyes when I went to town. The hardware store clerk who'd known me for 20 years suddenly seemed suspicious. The waitress at the diner avoided eye contact. Cordelia's poison was working, and for a moment, I wondered if we'd underestimated her ability to destroy reputations along with property. The breaking point came when she tried to bribe County Inspector Martinez to condemn our entire property as uninhabitable. The offer was $5,000, 0 cents cash, for a report that would force us to evacuate the island immediately. What she didn't know was that Martinez had grown up fishing with my father, and he brought the cash directly to me as evidence. But Cordelia's most dangerous move was also her most desperate. She arranged for an accidental fuel spill near my great-grandfather's cemetery, then claimed it was an environmental hazard that required immediate quarantine of our entire property. I was in my workshop when I heard the boat engines approaching. Through the window, I watched 3 men in hazmat suits motor toward our shoreline, carrying containers of what looked like motor oil. The plan was obvious. Stage a fake environmental disaster, then use it to justify seizing our property for public safety. The taste of fury was metallic in my mouth as I grabbed my camera and started filming. These bastards were going to desecrate my great-grandfather's gravesite to win a property dispute. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about the kind of evil that would destroy sacred ground to make a point. But I wasn't the only one watching. Marcus had positioned remote cameras throughout the area as part of our evidence-gathering operation. Winston had been monitoring county communications for any unusual activity, and Sage had been tracking unusual permit applications and emergency orders. The moment Cordelia's goons started pouring motor oil into the lake, every camera in the area started recording. We had multiple angles of the deliberate contamination, GPS coordinates of the exact location, and audio recordings of the men discussing their cleanup operation. What they didn't know was that I had already called the EPA hotline. Real environmental agents were on their way, and they'd arrived just in time to catch Cordelia's people red-handed. The irony was beautiful. In her desperation to frame me for environmental crimes, Cordelia had committed actual environmental crimes in front of multiple witnesses and recording devices. She'd just handed us the evidence we needed to destroy her. Here's your documentation nugget. Hidden cameras on your own property are completely legal. Document everything before confronting bad actors, because lies crumble under video evidence. While the fake hazmat team was busy with their staged spill, I was busy with my own preparations. The floating platform I'd built was now equipped with water sampling equipment, time-lapse cameras, and GPS tracking devices. Every violation at the resort was being documented in real time, creating an unbreakable chain of evidence. The bridge reconstruction was nearly complete, built to the exact specifications my great-grandfather had used 70 years ago. But this time, it was more than just a bridge. It was a symbol of our family's right to exist in the place we'd called home for generations. As I watched the EPA agents arrive to investigate the environmental emergency, I felt the weight of everything we were risking. If our plan failed, we'd lose more than just our property. We'd lose the last connection to a way of life that was already disappearing. But as I held the video evidence of Cordelia's people deliberately contaminating our lake, I knew we'd crossed a line she couldn't uncross. In 6 weeks, she'd be standing in front of 200 investors at her shareholders meeting, announcing expansion plans for a resort that would no longer exist. All I had to do was stay quiet, keep documenting, and let her dig her own grave. The hardest part wasn't gathering evidence, it was watching her destroy everything we loved while we waited for the perfect moment to strike back. The fake environmental spill was just the beginning. With only 4 weeks left before the shareholders' meeting, Cordelia was getting desperate, and desperate people make dangerous choices. The bribery attempt came through a middleman who thought he was being clever. Ray Hutchins, a local contractor who'd been doing work for the resort, approached me at the hardware store with what he called a generous offer from concerned parties. "Look, Jasper," he said, his voice low and nervous, "some folks think this whole thing has gotten out of hand. They're willing to pay you $300,000, 0 cents cash, to relocate somewhere nice and forget this ever happened." $300,000. More money than my family had ever seen at one time. For a split second, I thought about my grandmother's medical bills, the stress this was putting on her, the easier life that money could buy. "Before you say no," Ray continued, "think about your grandmother. She's 89 years old. Does she really need this stress in her final years? What happens if something unfortunate occurs?" The implied threat hit me like a punch to the gut. They were targeting my grandmother now, using her age and frailty as leverage. The taste of bile rose in my throat as I realized how far Cordelia was willing to go. "Ray," I said, loud enough for everyone in the hardware store to hear, "you can tell whoever sent you that the Thorne family doesn't negotiate with terrorists." The social media campaign escalated next. Suddenly, Facebook and Nextdoor were flooded with posts about my family's environmental terrorism and threat to public safety. Professional-looking graphics showed supposed pollution data, fake testimonials from concerned neighbors, and warnings about property values plummeting if we were allowed to continue our illegal activities. But Cordelia had made a critical error. She'd hired a social media company from the city, people who didn't understand that in small towns, everyone knows everyone. The concerned neighbors giving testimonials were stock photos. The local business owners warning about economic impact had addresses that traced back to empty lots. My grandmother, who'd never used social media in her life, became a viral sensation when Sage posted a video of her responding to the fake testimonials. "I've lived on this lake for 67 years, Dolores said, her voice clear and strong despite her age. "I've seen seasons change, families grow up, and fish populations rise and fall. But I've never seen anything as ugly as what's happening now. These people think they can buy the right to destroy our home." The video got 50,000 views in the first week and turned public opinion decisively in our favor. That's when Cordelia played her final card. She tried to have me arrested. The charges were creative, I'll give her that. Apparently, I was guilty of trespassing on public waterways, operating an illegal business without permits, and endangering public safety through unauthorized construction. The warrant was signed by a judge who'd been appointed after receiving campaign contributions from development interests. The arrest attempt happened on a Saturday morning while I was working on the bridge. Sheriff's deputies arrived by boat, led by a sergeant I didn't recognize, probably brought in from another county to avoid local complications. "Jasper Thorne," the sergeant called out, "you're under arrest for multiple violations of county codes and environmental regulations." The handcuffs felt cold against my wrists as they led me away from the bridge I'd been rebuilding with my own hands. For a moment, real fear crept in. What if this was it? What if Cordelia's connections were stronger than our evidence? What if my grandmother had to watch me go to prison for defending our family's rights? But as the boat pulled away from our island, I saw something that made my heart race with hope instead of fear. Winston was standing on the mainland dock with a briefcase full of legal documents. Marcus was setting up camera equipment to record everything. And Sage was live streaming the entire arrest on social media, narrating the events for a rapidly growing audience. "What you're seeing here," Sage said into her phone, "is the arrest of a man whose only crime was rebuilding a bridge that had been legally standing for 70 years. A bridge that was destroyed while he was at his great-grandfather's funeral." The live stream went viral within hours, the comments section filled with outrage from people who recognized the injustice, legal advice from lawyers who'd been following the story, and donations to a legal defense fund that someone had started without my knowledge. But the most important result was invisible. Federal investigators had been watching the live stream too. The FBI had been building a case against Cordelia's operation for months, and my arrest gave them the final piece they needed, evidence of conspiracy to use law enforcement for personal vendettas. The 6 hours I spent in that county jail cell were the longest of my life. The concrete walls smelled like disinfectant and despair. And I couldn't stop thinking about my grandmother, alone on the island, probably watching the news coverage and wondering if she'd lose her home and her grandson on the same day. But when Winston got me released on bail, everything had changed. The fake charges were dropped when the FBI informed the local judge that he was under investigation for corruption. The sheriff's department was placed under federal oversight, pending investigation of their role in the harassment campaign. And Cordelia? She was about to discover that using law enforcement as a personal weapon is a federal crime. Here's your legal protection nugget. Recording interactions with law enforcement is legal in most states. Document everything, because corrupt officials hate being caught on camera. Walking back across my newly completed bridge that evening, I felt the solid oak planks beneath my feet and knew we'd won more than just a legal battle. We'd exposed a system of corruption that had been operating in the shadows for years, hurting families who didn't have the resources to fight back. The smell of fresh wood and lake water mixed with the satisfaction of a job well done. But there was also something else. the metallic taste of adrenaline that comes from realizing how close we'd come to losing everything. In 2 weeks, Cordelia would be standing in front of her investors trying to explain why her resort was under federal investigation and her expansion plans were impossible. But first, she'd have to explain why she'd used her position to frame an innocent family for crimes she'd committed herself. The hardest part was over. Now came the reckoning, and this time, the whole world would be watching. Labor Day weekend arrived with the kind of perfect weather that makes people forget about their troubles and remember why they fell in love with lake life in the first place. The sun was shining, the water was calm, and the Lakeside Estates Resort was buzzing with activity as 200 investors, local officials, and media representatives gathered for what Cordelia had promised would be the most important shareholders' meeting in the resort's history. The irony wasn't lost on me. She'd chosen the weekend that most families used to celebrate the end of summer, the time when our lake had traditionally been filled with children's laughter and the sound of fishing boats heading out at dawn. Now it was filled with luxury yachts and the sound of people discussing property values. The meeting was held in the resort's lakeside pavilion, a fancy glass structure that offered panoramic views of the water and, unfortunately for Cordelia, a clear line of sight to my family's island where my newly rebuilt bridge stood as a testament to everything she'd tried to destroy. I arrived, uninvited, carrying a worn leather briefcase that had belonged to my great-grandfather and contained evidence that would end Cordelia's reign of terror. Winston walked beside me, his calm demeanor hiding the excitement of a lawyer who'd spent 40 years waiting for a case this satisfying. Marcus and Sage followed, carrying cameras and recording equipment that would document every moment of what was about to unfold. My grandmother had insisted on coming too, despite our protests about her age and the stress. "I've waited 67 years to see justice served," she'd said. "I'm not missing this." She sat in the back of the pavilion, her weathered hands folded over her purse, watching everything with the sharp eyes of someone who'd seen decades of injustice and was finally going to witness the scales balance. The smell of expensive cologne and catered food filled the air as we approached the pavilion. Through the glass walls, I could see Cordelia at the podium, impeccably dressed in a designer suit, gesturing toward architectural renderings of her proposed $10 million zero-cent expansion. She looked confident, powerful, completely in control of her domain. She had no idea that federal agents were already positioned around the property. "Ladies and gentlemen," Cordelia was saying as we entered, "what you're seeing here represents the future of luxury lakeside living. Phase 2 of our development will double our capacity while maintaining the highest environmental standards." The sound of her voice made my skin crawl, but I forced myself to wait. Timing was everything, and Winston had coached me on exactly when to make my move. And I'm pleased to announce that we've finally resolved the last obstacle to our expansion. The unauthorized structure that has been blocking our shoreline development has been permanently removed, and we now have clear title to... That's when I stood up. The room went quiet as 200 pairs of eyes turned to look at the uninvited guest in work clothes and boots. Cordelia's face went pale when she recognized me, and I could see her calculating whether she could have me removed before I said anything damaging. "I'm sorry to interrupt," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the pavilion, "but I think there's been some confusion about property rights and environmental compliance." "Security!" Cordelia called out, but the security guards were nowhere to be seen. That's because they were currently being interviewed by FBI agents about their role in the harassment campaign. "Mrs. Brightwater," I continued, "you mentioned clear title to shoreline development. I'd like to know how you plan to develop land that you don't actually own." I opened my briefcase and pulled out the original 1952 deed, holding it up for everyone to see. "This document shows that my family owns the mineral and water rights to this entire lake, including the lake bottom where your resort's docks, swimming areas, and septic discharge points are located." The murmur that ran through the crowd was like the sound of a dam starting to crack. Investors started pulling out their phones, taking pictures of the document, whispering urgent questions to each other. "That's ridiculous," Cordelia shouted, her composed facade finally cracking. "This man is a troublemaker who's been harassing our operation for months. He's facing multiple criminal charges for—" "Actually," Winston said, standing up with his own briefcase, "those charges were dropped when the FBI discovered they were filed fraudulently. along with the safety inspection that justified destroying his family's bridge, the environmental violations that were fabricated to harass his family, and the liens that were filed illegally to force them off their property. The crowd was getting restless now. I could see investors checking their phones, probably Googling news stories about federal investigations and corruption charges. But here's the really interesting part, I said, pulling out Marcus's environmental data. Mrs. Brightwater has been telling you about her environmental stewardship. Let me show you what 3 years of scientific monitoring reveals about the actual environmental impact of this resort. Marcus stood up and connected his laptop to the pavilion's projection system. Within seconds, charts and graphs showing declining water quality, fish population collapse, and illegal septic discharge filled the screen behind Cordelia. The resort you invested in, I continued, was built on federally protected wetlands without proper permits. It's been operating year-round despite seasonal restrictions. It's been discharging untreated waste into protected waters. And every day of operation has been a federal crime. That's when the doors opened and FBI agents entered the pavilion. The lead agent, a woman named Sarah Chen, walked directly to the podium where Cordelia was standing, her heels clicking against the floor like a countdown to justice. "Mrs. Brightwater," Agent Chen said, her voice calm but authoritative, "you're under arrest for violations of the Clean Water Act, conspiracy to commit fraud, and using intimidation to interfere with federal investigations." The room erupted. Investors were shouting questions, local officials were trying to distance themselves from the scandal, and media representatives were frantically taking notes and photos. But I wasn't done yet. I had one more card to play, the moment I'd been waiting for since the day they destroyed my great-grandfather's bridge. "There's something else you should know," I said, waiting for the crowd to quiet down. "As the legal owner of the lake bottom where this resort is operating, I'm hereby serving notice that all operations must cease immediately. You have 48 hours to remove all structures from my property." I pulled out my phone and showed the live stream that Sage had been broadcasting. This entire meeting has been watched by over 100,000 people online. The EPA is conducting emergency inspections of the facility as we speak, and every investor who put money into this illegal operation is about to discover what happens when you build a business on other people's property without permission. The look on Cordelia's face as the handcuffs clicked into place was worth every sleepless night, every legal threat, every moment of fear that we might lose our home. She'd spent 3 years systematically destroying our community, using corruption and intimidation to silence anyone who opposed her vision. Now she was about to spend the next 10 years in federal prison, and her multi-million-dollar resort was about to become a cautionary tale about what happens when greed meets justice. As the FBI led her away, I heard her shouting about lawyers and appeals and how this was all a misunderstanding, but her voice was drowned out by the sound of investors demanding their money back and reporters asking questions about the full scope of the corruption. I looked back at my grandmother, sitting in the back of the pavilion with tears streaming down her face. Not tears of sadness, but tears of relief. The kind that come when you finally see justice served, after decades of watching bullies win. The best part? The whole thing was being live-streamed to an audience that had grown to over 200,000 people, including environmental groups, property rights activists, and families who'd been fighting similar battles against corrupt HOAs across the country. Justice had been served and everyone was watching. 6 months later, I'm standing on the bridge my great-grandfather built, watching the sunrise paint Clearwater Lake in shades of gold and amber that remind me why this place is worth fighting for. The water is so clear I can see fish swimming 20 feet down, actual thriving fish, not the struggling survivors that were barely hanging on when Cordelia's resort was poisoning their habitat. The immediate aftermath of the shareholders' meeting was like watching dominoes fall in the most satisfying way possible. Within 48 hours, the EPA had shut down the resort's operations and begun emergency environmental remediation. The septic systems were pumped and sealed, the illegal docks were removed, and the swimming areas were cordoned off until the contamination could be cleaned up. Cordelia's legal troubles multiplied faster than algae in a polluted lake. Federal charges for environmental crimes, state charges for fraud and conspiracy, civil lawsuits from investors who'd been defrauded, and a mountain of back taxes on the income she'd hidden from illegal operations. Her legal fees alone exceeded $750,000, 0 cents, before she finally accepted a plea deal that would send her to federal prison for 8 years. But the real poetry was in what happened to her precious resort. The federal court ordered the property to be sold to pay restitution to victims of her crimes. The buyer? A consortium of environmental groups and local families who converted the entire facility into a public nature preserve and educational center. The Lakeside Estates Resort is now the Ezra Thorne Memorial Nature Center, named after my great-grandfather and dedicated to protecting the lake ecosystem he'd loved for nearly a century. The luxury suites have been converted into research facilities and educational classrooms. The conference center hosts workshops on sustainable lake management and property rights protection. The boat docks are now used by school groups studying aquatic ecology. My grandmother Dolores lived to see the transformation, and she spent her final months giving tours to visitors who wanted to hear the story of how one family's fight for justice became a model for environmental protection. She passed away peacefully last spring, sitting in her favorite chair on the bridge, watching the sunset reflect off water that was finally healing. Her last words were, "Ezra would be proud." The legal precedent our case established has been used by families across the country fighting similar battles against corrupt HOAs and illegal developments. Winston, who came out of retirement to help us, has been fielding calls from lawyers representing property owners who discovered their rights were being violated by people who thought money could buy anything. The Ezra Thorne Environmental Foundation, which I established with part of the $2,300,000 0-cent settlement, provides free legal aid to families fighting HOA abuse and environmental crimes. We've helped 47 families keep their homes and properties, and we've exposed corruption in development projects from California to Florida. Our success rate? 89%. Turns out that when you shine sunlight on corruption, it tends to shrivel up and die. But the Foundation's proudest achievement is the scholarship program for environmental science students. Every year, we award full college scholarships to young people who want to study lake ecology, environmental law, or sustainable development. The first recipient was Marcus Rivera's daughter, who's now studying environmental engineering at the State University and plans to become the next generation of lake protectors. The lake itself has become a success story that environmental groups point to as proof that ecosystems can recover when illegal pollution is stopped. Fish populations have increased by 340% in just 6 months. Water clarity has improved to levels not seen since the 1,990 migratory birds have returned to nest in the restored wetlands. And the toxic algae blooms that plagued the lake during the resort's operation have completely disappeared. My boat building workshop has been expanded into a teaching facility where I pass on traditional craftsmanship techniques to young people who want to learn skills that connect them to the natural world. The smell of cedar shavings and varnish still fills the air, but now it's mixed with the voices of students learning to shape wood with their hands instead of depending on machines for everything. The bridge itself has become a symbol of resistance that draws visitors from around the country. People come to see the structure that sparked a battle against corruption and won. They walk across the hand-hewn planks that my great-grandfather carved in 1952, and they understand that some things are worth fighting for, no matter how powerful the opposition seems. Here's your final takeaway. Property rights, environmental protection, and community values are worth defending, even when the fight seems impossible. Sometimes the little guy really can win, but only if they're willing to stand up and fight. The morning mist is rising off the lake as I finish my coffee and prepare for another day of building boats and teaching young people that they have the power to shape their world. The sound of loons calling to each other echoes across the water, a sound that had almost disappeared during the resort's operation, but has returned now that the lake is healing. Standing here on this bridge, I can feel my great-grandfather's presence in every plank beneath my feet, my grandmother's wisdom in every ripple on the water, and the promise of a future where communities don't have to choose between progress and preservation. 3 generations of Thornus have called this place home, and if I have anything to say about it, 3 more generations will follow. The bridge stands strong, the water runs clear, and the community that was almost destroyed by greed has emerged stronger than ever. But this isn't the end of the story, it's just the beginning. Last week I got a call from a family in Texas whose mineral rights are being stolen by an oil company with connections to local politicians. The corruption is deeper, The stakes are higher, and the bad guys have even more money and power. Sounds like they're going to need some help from people who know how to fight back.
I hope you enjoyed this thrilling journey. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate this story? Let me know in the comments below. Your feedback inspires more epic tales.